He had an accident at work. When he woke up, he was already lying in the hospital. He thought it was just a simple burn at first, but was diagnosed with late-stage AIDS. He had roughly 30 days left to live. Ron instantly burst out laughing. In Ron's shallow understanding, AIDS was a disease only gay people got.
You fucking kidding me? I ain't no faggot, motherfucker. I don't even know no fucking faggot. Look at me. What do you see, huh? Goddamn rodeo's what you see.
And he hated gay people the most. Naturally, he couldn't believe he had AIDS, let alone that he only had 30 days left to live. Despite the doctor repeatedly telling Ron that his T-cell count had dropped to 9, 50 times lower than that of a normal person, and that surviving at this point was already a miracle, Ron refused to believe it. He looked at the test report with disdain, raised his hand, and slammed it at the doctor who had insulted him, then turned around and left confidently. After returning home, Ron not only didn't take the diagnosis seriously, but even became more reckless than before. He still picked up girls and went dancing, still went horse racing, but as he played, Ron's gaze began to grow hazy. In a daze, a bright red 30-day countdown appeared on the wall calendar. Then he started experiencing frequent, prolonged ringing in his ears. At first, Ron thought he had just partied too hard, but in reality, the doctor's words had been crystal clear. His condition was at rock bottom, so severe that even a simple cough could bring up blood. And this was only the first day of the 30-day countdown. But even so, Ron still firmly believed in his knight's aura, insisting it was impossible for him to get sick. However, a comment from a friend next.
Shit, I hear you can get that just by touching someone, or queers get it. Fucking faggots.
That's it. Exactly why it's a mistake.
Well, what if it ain't?
What ain't?
A mistake.
Sent a jolt through Ron's heart, though Ron showed no outward reaction, even joking and laughing with his friend. In truth, his mind was in chaos. Perhaps it was an instinctive fear of death, or perhaps fear of the symptoms, but the next day, Ron hurried to the library to look up relevant information. And with that research, Ron's world collapsed instantly. Besides homosexual transmission, AIDS had other main routes of spread, and Ron had checked every single one of them. What chilled him to the bone even more was the woman in the bullfighting arena last month, her arms covered in needle marks. How reckless she had been then, and how crushed she must feel now. But now, despite Ron's seething anger, he had to accept this cruel reality. He did have AIDS, and he wouldn't survive 30 days. Driven by a desperate desire to live, Ron frantically began searching for any information that could extend his life. Fortunately, he really found something. A new drug from a pharmaceutical company that could effectively treat AIDS. He rushed to the hospital in a panic, but unlike his previous arrogance, this time Ron was begging the doctor to prescribe it. But the doctor's words pushed Ron.
The next industry, they just released it for testing. Oh, and I want to buy some.
For about a year, a group of patients gets either the drug or a placebo. It's totally left up to chance. Not even doctors are allowed to know.
Who had just seen a glimmer of hope to the edge of a cliff once again. Because the drug was still in the trial phase and only selected experimental subjects could use it, clearly Ron didn't qualify. The fear of death forced Ron not to give up. He pulled out a list of miracle drugs from other countries, reading them off one by one as if grasping at straws. But to Ron's despair, none of these drugs had approval from the Drug Regulatory Agency, let alone being sold on the market. In an instant, the light in Ron's eyes went out. Now the only path left for him was to wait for death. Nike, unable to bear it, kindly suggested he join a peer support group, saying it might make him feel better. But Ron felt utterly humiliated. Desperate, Ron went to a bar to drown his sorrows. In his view, rather than dying in fear, he might as well spend his last days carefree with his friends. However, to his shock, his most trusted friend had spread the news that Ron had AIDS. Now everyone thought Ron was gay. Friends who had once called him brother now provocatively called him sweetheart or baby, and some even whistled at him. This completely crossed Ron's bottom line. Blood rushed to his head, and he threw a punch at the other person. But after being hit, the other didn't fight back. They were afraid of coming into contact with Ron's blood. Looking at these self-righteous friends, Ron spat at them viciously, then cut ties with them completely. But after doing all that, Ron had nowhere left to go. With no choice, he went to the peer support group. Unlike his friends' provocations, the people here were exceptionally kind, but Ron repaid their kindness with ingratitude. In just 3 days, Ron's life had been mercilessly overturned. the countdown to death, betrayal by friends. Everything had pushed this iron-willed man to a corner with no escape. Even Ron, who had never believed in God, became devout in that moment. Unexpectedly, things really took a turn for the better. With the help of a hospital cleaner, Ron successfully obtained the ACT medication. With the life-extending drug in hand, Ron was rejuvenated. He resumed his once reckless lifestyle, and aside from occasional bouts of melancholy during quiet nights, life seemed much the same as before. But the good times didn't last long. On the 28th day of Ron's illness, the hospital suddenly tightened its controls. Ron had paid the money, but instead of receiving the stolen medication from the cleaner, he was only given an address, told that the drugs were there. Feeling utterly betrayed, Ron flew into a rage, ready to confront the cleaner with his fists. But the cleaner easily dodged him, and instead, Ron collapsed in a dizzy spell. When he woke up again, Ron was already in the hospital. The fact that he had secretly used ACT had been exposed. Facing the hospital's investigation, loyal Ron didn't rat out the cleaner who had scammed him. Although the matter was eventually dropped, Ron's body couldn't hold on much longer. Just as Ron closed his eyes, waiting to die, his bedside neighbor suddenly barged in. With a smile on his face, Rayon approached Ron's bed to greet him. Rayon's enthusiasm was met with a cold shoulder from Ron, who rolled his eyes and left in annoyance. But less than a minute later, he returned, a deck of cards in hand. This successfully reignited Ron's drug craving. After a few rounds, Ron not only lost everything, but the disease also attacked him again. What Ron didn't expect was that this gay man he had looked down upon would completely reconstruct his shattered life. As an ACT clinical trial patient, Rayon generously gave Ron 2 ACT pills. At the sight of the ACT, Ron's parched world finally received a downpour. But just as he wanted more ACT, Rayon couldn't provide any more, and those 2 pills were all he had left. Ron's newly ignited hope was once again extinguished. He knew that under these circumstances, lying in the hospital was no different from waiting to die. As soon as he reached his doorstep, the sight before him filled him with despair. The word gay was spray-painted in bright red all over the walls, and the door had been maliciously locked. Ron had had enough of all this. The pent-up frustration and anger of the past few days finally overflowed at this moment. The only response he got was barking from a dog. Ron couldn't take it anymore. He pulled out a shotgun and vented his fury. Fortunately, none of his money or his parents' keepsakes inside were stolen. Ron took his meager belongings and his parents' mementos and vanished into the night, just like his life, which saw not a glimmer of hope. The car drove from night into day, but his life was heading from light into eternal darkness. Ron didn't know where he was going, or what he was going to do. When the car ran out of gas, he pulled over to the side of the road. At this point, only 1 day remained until the death date the doctor had declared. Watching the sunrise ahead, Ron felt an unprecedented coldness and despair. He picked up the gun several times, attempting to kill himself, but couldn't go through with it. In the end, he could only alternate between crying and laughing, until he completely broke down. After the breakdown, Ron, still unwilling to accept his fate about the future, chose to make peace with himself, and on the final day of his life countdown, he arrived at the Mexican doctor's clinic. The clinic was dilapidated, and the doctor had even had his medical license revoked. But he told Ron a shocking secret. To survive, Ron had to stop taking ACT, because ACT not only killed cancer cells, but also healthy ones. Yet this terrifying drug was being used by the pharmaceutical company for profit, experimenting on patients. They gave different patients either sugar pills or real ACT. If, after a year, the mortality rate of patients taking ACT was lower than those taking sugar pills, the drug would be deemed effective and marketed. But in reality, Ron, who had been taking ACT, had become so weak that even a minor cold could kill him. The bloody truth shattered Ron's already faint hope completely. Just as Ron thought he was doomed, the doctor prescribed him a drug called DDC. It had the same efficacy as ACT, but with half the side effects. Under the doctor's treatment, Ron, who had been given a 30-day life expectancy, miraculously survived for another 3 months. The newly revived Ron not only looked increasingly rosy-cheeked, but even sensed a huge business opportunity. He and the Mexican doctor hit it off instantly, planning to smuggle large quantities of DDC into the United States. But when crossing the border, Ron, disguised as a priest, was discovered, along with the 3,000 doses of DDC. Fortunately, the investigating officer was a believer, and Ron managed to talk his way out of trouble with just one. And just like that, Ron narrowly escaped disaster, successfully bringing 3,000 DDC pills to the United States. But new troubles quickly followed. The sick LGBTQ+ community didn't trust him, a straight man who had discriminated against gays, let alone the unverified medications he was holding. Ron scrambled back and forth for days, Yet in the end, he couldn't sell even a single bottle. Just as he was at his wit's end, Rayon suddenly appeared. Facing someone who had once treated him kindly, Ron instead turned hostile. To Ron's surprise, Rayon immediately asked for a quantity sufficient for 20 people. But before Ron could even celebrate, Rayon added a condition. He wanted a 25% cut. Even with that, Ron still stood to make a hefty profit, so he agreed without hesitation. The two hit it off instantly. One responsible for opening up the market, the other for securing the supply. They quickly sold all 3,000 DDC pills. Not only that, but the accompanying medications sold out too. By then, the two had become natural business partners. Ron, who had once disliked people like Rayon, began to slowly accept them and even integrate into their community. However, the two soon drew attention. Before long, the FDA arrived to investigate, but to the investigators' surprise, Ron's current drug sales were not only legal, they were also compliant. Meanwhile, ACT, the drug that had killed countless patients, was officially launched, even becoming the most expensive drug in the United States at the time. For ordinary treatment, patients had to spend over $800 a month. This coincidentally played right into Ron's hands.
Hey, everybody, let's get this straight. Membership, $400. You're a member, you get the meds. If you're not a member, you don't. Got it? I'm not running a goddamn charity.
The exorbitant cost of ACT and its disproportionate effectiveness made Ron's club overflow with people. Yet even at $400, some still couldn't afford it. To keep the club running, Ron chose to play the villain for once. As Ron's business grew larger and larger, the supply of drugs from Mexico couldn't keep up with demand. To help the patients, and to ensure his own survival, Ron brought back a new miracle drug from Japan. Unfortunately, as soon as he stepped off the plane, Ron suddenly experienced ringing in his ears. He barely managed to inject the medication, but this time, he collapsed directly. When he woke up, the first thing Ron saw was the doctor who had once given him a 30-day death countdown. Ironically, Dr. Seward didn't seem surprised. Instead of asking how Ron had survived 2 years when he was supposed to die in 30 days, he scolded Ron for harming himself. Ron found it absurd. He just wanted to live, to not be treated like a lab rat. What was wrong with that? But the over 2,000 bottles of drugs he had brought back were still confiscated by the FDA. But this didn't deter Ron's determination to live. With 2 months left, he traveled all over the world and found a drug supplier again. This time, even more people came to him to buy medicine. Ron made a fortune, but before he could even celebrate, uninvited guests barged into the club. It was Dr. Nike from the hospital. When Nike learned from patients that Ron was selling drugs illegally, he was furious. He feared the drugs would harm the patients. But when the data was presented to him, along with the patients who had already been given a death sentence by the hospital, yet were still standing alive before him, Nike had no choice but to believe that Ron's drugs were more effective than ACT. In that instant, he fell silent, pretending he knew nothing. However, while Nike could sit back, Dr. Seward at the hospital couldn't. The patients were his cash cows. Now that they were all going to Ron, how could he make money? So a tax evasion complaint was filed. Soon, Ron's club was shut down due to tax issues. Not only were all the drugs confiscated, but Ron himself faced hefty fines. But for Ron, that wasn't the most important thing anymore. What mattered was, what would happen to the patients who had entrusted their lives to him in the future? By then, he was completely at a loss. What made Ron even more desperate was that the FDA also issued a permanent regulation targeting him. Ordinary individuals could only purchase drugs with a doctor's prescription. This meant Ron's business was completely ruined. He asked every doctor he could find, but none were willing to issue prescriptions for the club. Now, he had neither money nor drugs. Fate seemed to have brought him back to square one, but he wanted to live, and so did the club members. The only way left for him was to reopen the club. But because of the hefty fines, he couldn't even afford the rent now, let alone anything else. Just as Ron was about to give up, the landlord unexpectedly stepped forward.
We don't want money.
What the fuck you want?
The house is free. We want to help.
The housing issue was resolved, but the funds for restocking loomed like an insurmountable mountain. In front of Ron, he took off the women's clothing, put on a suit, and stood awkwardly in front of his wealthy father. The two, who hadn't seen each other in over a decade, showed not a trace of joy on their faces. The father even sneered, asking how his son could bear to take off the women's clothes. Rayon didn't mind any of this. Instead, he smiled and told his father that he was in the late stages of AIDS and would die soon. In that instant, the father, who had just been full of disdain, was now overwhelmed with shock and sorrow. Seeing his father like this, Rayon could no longer hold back. And just like that,
I'm sorry, Dad. I met somebody who's been very kind to me.
and I'd like to repay that debt. But I need help.
Rayon smoothly obtained the life-saving money for the club from his father. He casually tossed a thick wad of cash onto the table. Ron looked on in disbelief. Rayon didn't tell Ron the truth, choosing instead to remain silent. This only made Ron even more puzzled. That embrace marked Ron's true reconciliation with the LGBTQ+ patients, but it also became their final farewell. With the venue and money secured, only one final step remained. Ron went to Dr. Nike, hoping he could help write some prescriptions. But the hospital had its rules, and Nike could only politely decline. Yet Ron had already anticipated this. As soon as he entered, he had used an oversized hat to block Nike's view, then swiped a prescription pad. Dr. Nike was completely unaware of any of this. With all the paperwork in hand, Ron immediately flew to Mexico, preparing to import a new miracle drug, even more effective than DDC. But just the day after Ron left, Rayon's condition suddenly took a sharp turn for the worse. Though he had prepared himself for death countless times, when the moment truly arrived, he still collapsed instantly. Perhaps unable to bear seeing Rayon in pain, his boyfriend took him to the hospital, which only accelerated Rayon's death. Upon hearing the news, Ron rushed back with all his might, hoping to use the golden key to save Rayon's fading life. But in the end, it was all too late. In just a few hours, Dr. Seward's act, like death itself, claimed Rayon's vibrant life. By the time Ron arrived at the hospital, Rayon had already been placed in a garbage bag, vanishing from this world he had both loved and suffered in. Enraged, Ron blamed everything on Dr. Seward. That night, Ron cried for a very, very long time. And in that moment, he made a major decision. He would no longer turn away patients who couldn't afford medication, even giving it to them for free. But as a result, the already shaky club quickly fell into crisis. At first, the club was Ron's way to make money. After Rayon's death, he only wanted to save lives. Seeing the ACT research papers Ron had brought back, Dr. Nike was shocked. A healer who had saved lives, he didn't know when he had become a executioner for capital. In that instant of shattered faith, his career, like the wall he smashed into, appeared pristine on the surface, but was already crumbling inside. But reality was reality. No matter how rotten and foul everything was, if he wanted to keep going, he could only cover it up with something beautiful, even if it wasn't good. To save more people, Dr. Nike rushed to the hospital immediately, reducing all patients' ACT doses to the minimum. Then he placed flyers exposing the ACT scandal in the most prominent spots in the hospital, and that was the limit of what he could do in his position. However, the hospital soon discovered his actions and forced him to resign. At the press conference, Ron barged in, IV drip in tow. Facing malicious attacks and insults, Ron didn't care at all. He had only one goal for coming: to expose the collusion between the FDA and the pharmaceutical company. But they struck back, accusing Ron of being a profit-driven drug dealer. Ron's accusations were thunderous, but he could never wake those who pretended to sleep. After leaving the flyers, Ron left the venue like a knight returning from battle, not looking back. Since Rayon's death, Dr. Nike had become Ron's closest friend, and that night, Ron opened his heart to someone for the first time.
I got one life, right? Mine. But fuck, I want somebody else sometimes. Sometimes I just feel like I'm fighting for life. I just ain't got time to live. I want it to mean something.
In the days that followed, Ron's condition worsened. Frequent ringing in his ears and physical pain tortured him, making him wish for death. Yet even so, Ron persisted. Finally, 6 months later, he sued the FDA in court. The court issued a stern warning to the FDA for forcing patients to use ACT, but dismissed Ron's demand for AIDS patients' right to choose their own medications, citing a lack of legal basis. In the end, Ron's battle ended in failure. Defeated, he grew despondent. He wanted his life to have value, but the stone pressing on his chest never moved. He didn't know where his future lay, nor whether AIDS patients like him had any hope of survival. Yet when he pushed open the club's door, his fellow patients greeted him like a hero returning in triumph. Shaking his hand and embracing him. In that moment, Ron finally let go. His life's value was all right here. In the end, Ron became a true matador. At that moment, he clenched tightly the reins of fate in his hands. Even if the road ahead was rough and uneven, as long as he could hold on for one more second, even in failure, he would never give up easily. That was his victory. And with that, the story ends.